"You're going to have to find somewhere else to eat," Kyle Benson said loud enough for every table near the entrance to hear. His smile thin and practiced as though he had delivered those words 100 times before. "Because this restaurant is for paying families, not people looking for handouts." The laughter that followed wasn't loud, but it was loud enough. Forks paused halfway to mouths. Conversations softened into whispers. A little girl sitting near the front window looked up from her grilled cheese sandwich and quietly asked her father, "Why won't they let him come inside?" The question floated through the warm dining room filled with homemade pies, framed family photographs, and the smell of fresh cornbread. But nobody answered her. Ethan Brooks stood just inside the doorway wearing dark blue jeans, clean white sneakers, and a navy polo that looked ordinary enough to disappear into any crowd. He carried no expensive watch, no designer jacket, no security detail, nothing that announced he was one of the most respected CEOs in the country. His expression never changed. He simply looked past Kyle toward the dining room where families laughed beneath old photographs hanging on the walls. Every frame seemed familiar. Every table reminded him of another time, another life. He had imagined this visit differently. Tonight wasn't about business. It wasn't about recognition. It wasn't even about dinner. It was about memory. Kyle folded his arms and blocked the entrance completely. "Did you hear me?" he asked. "We're full." Ethan slowly glanced across the restaurant. 3 empty booths sat near the back, freshly cleaned with silverware already waiting. A couple entering behind him noticed them too but said nothing. Before Ethan could respond, Megan Foster, the evening manager, approached with confident steps and an expression that suggested she had already reached her conclusion before hearing a single word. Her eyes traveled from Ethan's shoes to his face, lingering just long enough to communicate exactly what she believed. "Is there a problem here?" she asked. Kyle shrugged. "Just another guy insisting he deserves a table." Megan offered Ethan a professional smile that never reached her eyes. "Sir, we reserve the right to refuse service. I think another restaurant might be a better fit." Ethan remained calm. "May I ask why?" Megan gestured vaguely toward the dining room. "We're prioritizing regular guests tonight." As she finished speaking, another family walked through the front door. Megan greeted them warmly, picked up 2 menus, and personally escorted them toward one of the empty booths she had just implied didn't exist. Ethan watched without saying a word. Several customers noticed the contradiction immediately. A young waitress carrying iced tea slowed her pace, her forehead tightening with uncertainty as she glanced from the newly seated family back to Ethan still standing alone near the entrance. An older gentleman folded his newspaper and quietly observed the scene unfolding only a few feet away. The restaurant no longer felt comfortable. The scent of fresh biscuits still drifted through the air. But something heavier settled over the room, something impossible to ignore. Ethan slipped one hand into his pocket, not searching for proof of who he was, not preparing an argument, but simply steadying himself. He had experienced this look before. Different city, different building, same assumption, the same silent calculation that decided who belonged before anyone spoke. Megan straightened the reservation stand and said with finality, "I think we're done here." Ethan met her eyes with a calm that unsettled her more than anger ever could. "No," he answered quietly. "I don't believe we are." Ethan Brooks did not argue because experience had taught him that some conversations revealed more through silence than debate. He simply remained where he was, his posture relaxed, his hands at his sides, while the quiet tension inside the restaurant continued to spread from one table to the next. The evening crowd had arrived expecting comfort food, familiar faces, and the easy warmth that had made this family restaurant a neighborhood tradition for more than 40 years. Instead, every guest near the entrance had become an unwilling witness to a moment that felt increasingly difficult to explain away. Ethan looked across the dining room again, allowing his eyes to settle on a corner booth beneath a faded photograph of the restaurant's grand opening decades earlier. His mother had once pointed at that same picture when he was only 9 years old, smiling as she told him that places built on kindness lasted longer than buildings built on money. Every other Friday, after she finished her shift at the local hospital, she would save enough from her paycheck to bring him here for one simple dinner. They never ordered the most expensive meal. Sometimes they shared a single plate and one slice of apple pie. To Ethan, it had always tasted like success because his mother called it their celebration dinner. proof that even difficult weeks deserved gratitude. Years later, after building one company into another, and eventually leading one of the country's largest charitable foundations alongside his business empire, Ethan never forgot those evenings. When he quietly learned that the restaurant had struggled during a devastating economic downturn several years earlier, he chose not to announce himself, schedule interviews, or attach his name to a campaign. Instead, an anonymous series of donations had arrived through a private foundation with one simple instruction: keep the doors open, protect the employees, preserve the place for the families who still needed it. Almost no one knew where the money had come from, and that was exactly how Ethan wanted it. Recognition had never been the purpose. Memory had been. Megan glanced impatiently toward the growing line forming near the hostess stand before turning back to Ethan once again. She seemed increasingly uncomfortable that he had neither protested nor walked away. Most people she turned away either apologized or became angry. His calm unsettled her because it refused to fit the story she had already written in her mind. Across the room, the young waitress who had hesitated earlier quietly approached another employee and whispered something while stealing another glance toward the entrance. She could not explain why the man standing outside the dining room seemed familiar, only that something about his composure felt impossible to ignore. The older gentleman who had folded his newspaper earlier removed his glasses and continued watching in thoughtful silence. Even the little girl near the window had not returned to her meal. She continued looking toward Ethan with innocent confusion that only children could express without fear. The cheerful conversations that usually filled the restaurant no longer carried the same warmth. They had become cautious, interrupted by curious looks and unanswered questions. Ethan finally inhaled slowly, reached into his pocket, and gently removed his phone. His thumb rested over a familiar contact for only a moment before he pressed the screen. When the call connected, his voice remained steady and almost conversational. "Good evening, Grace. I have arrived. I believe it is time for Mr. Harold Whitmore to join us in the dining room." Megan watched Ethan lower his phone with a faint smile that carried more confidence than she expected from someone she believed she had already dismissed. She crossed her arms and let out a quiet laugh that several nearby guests could hear. "Calling someone is not going to change our policy," she said. "If you are trying to have a friend convince us to seat you, you are wasting everyone's time." Kyle leaned against the hostess stand and joined her amusement. "Maybe he is calling another restaurant that has room," he joked. A few uncomfortable smiles appeared around the entrance, but they disappeared almost as quickly as they came. The atmosphere no longer felt light. It felt strained, as though the dining room itself was waiting for something nobody could yet explain. Ethan simply slipped his phone back into his pocket. "Thank you," he said quietly. "Someone will be here shortly." Megan shook her head. "Sir, you need to leave the entrance. You are making our guests uncomfortable." Ethan slowly looked around the room. "Am I?" he asked. His voice remained calm, yet several customers lowered their eyes, realizing that the discomfort had not started with him. It had started the moment assumptions replaced hospitality. At that moment, the young waitress who had been watching from across the room gathered enough courage to step closer. Her name tag read Emily Carter. She spoke carefully, almost afraid of interrupting. "Manager Foster," she said softly. "I think we should check before asking him to leave." Megan turned immediately. "Check what?" Emily hesitated. "I cannot explain it, but I feel like I have seen him before. Maybe in one of the staff meetings or one of the foundation presentations." Kyle rolled his eyes. "Emily, you have worked here for 3 months. You do not know every customer who walks through that door." Emily nodded politely but continued looking at Ethan. There was something familiar about the way he carried himself. Not arrogant, not demanding, just completely certain that truth did not need to rush. Before she could say anything else, another family entered the restaurant. Megan welcomed them with the same bright smile she had never offered Ethan and immediately escorted them toward another empty table. The contrast did not go unnoticed. The older gentleman near the window finally stood from his booth, folded his newspaper under one arm, and walked slowly toward the entrance. "Excuse me," he said to Megan. "I have been coming here since your father owned this place. Those tables have been empty for the last 15 minutes. Why exactly can this gentleman not be seated?" Megan forced another smile. We reserve tables based on operational needs. The gentleman looked across the dining room before returning his attention to her. Interesting. I have never seen operational needs depend on who is standing at the front door. His words settled over the restaurant like a quiet challenge. Several guests exchanged glances. Others nodded almost imperceptibly. Emily noticed something else. Near the hallway leading to the private office hung a framed photograph from a charity dinner held several years earlier. She had dusted that frame dozens of times during closing shifts. She turned her head toward it, then back toward Ethan. Her eyes widened ever so slightly. The resemblance was undeniable. Yet the memory refused to fully settle into place. As she stared at the photograph again, her heartbeat quickened. Whatever she was beginning to remember had the feeling of a truth that was about to change everything inside the restaurant. Emily could not ignore the feeling any longer. She quietly stepped away from the hostess stand and walked toward the hallway where the framed photographs chronicled the restaurant's history. There were pictures of holiday dinners, community fundraisers, scholarship ceremonies, and anniversary celebrations stretching back decades. Her eyes searched each frame until they landed on one taken 5 years earlier during a fundraising banquet. Standing beside Harold Whitmore, smiling modestly while refusing the spotlight, was the same man now waiting patiently near the entrance. Emily's breath caught. She remembered the orientation packet every new employee received during training. Harold had spoken with unmistakable gratitude about an anonymous benefactor whose generosity had saved the restaurant when bankruptcy seemed unavoidable. The donor had eventually agreed to attend one private appreciation dinner, after insisting that no public announcement be made. Emily looked from the photograph back to Ethan, then back again. There was no doubt. She hurried toward Megan, lowering her voice. "Manager Foster, I think we have made a terrible mistake." Megan barely looked at her. "Not now, Emily." Emily persisted. "Please look at the picture in the hallway. I think that is him." Kyle laughed before Megan could respond. "You are telling me the richest donor in this restaurant's history walked in wearing jeans and sneakers with nobody recognizing him?" Emily answered carefully. "I am saying we should verify before we keep refusing service." Megan sighed impatiently. "You are new here, so let me teach you something. Wealthy people announce themselves. Important people do not stand quietly at the front door waiting to be ignored." Ethan heard every word but remained completely still. His silence carried no embarrassment, only patience. Across the dining room, the older gentleman slowly approached the framed photograph as well. He studied it for several seconds before turning toward Ethan. His eyes widened with recognition. "I remember that evening," he said softly, almost to himself. Harold thanked one guest more than anyone else, but the gentleman refused to let his name appear in the newspaper. He looked directly at Ethan. "Were you at that dinner?" Ethan offered a small, respectful smile. "Yes, sir. I was." The older gentleman nodded once, as though a puzzle had finally found its missing piece. "I thought I recognized you." Several nearby guests overheard the exchange. Their conversations faded again, replaced by curious whispers spreading from table to table. Megan noticed the shifting mood and immediately tried to regain control. "Everyone, please enjoy your meals," she called with practiced confidence. There is nothing unusual happening here. But the reassurance came too late. Curiosity had already replaced certainty. Emily walked toward the office hallway without waiting for permission. She knocked gently on the closed office door, hoping Harold Whitmore had returned from his supplier meeting. There was no answer. She reached for the office phone at the service station instead, dialing the direct extension listed for emergencies. It rang twice before a familiar voice answered. "Harold Whitmore speaking." Emily swallowed hard. "Mr. Whitmore, I am sorry to interrupt you, but I think you need to come back to the dining room immediately. There is a guest here that everyone else may have misunderstood." There was a brief silence on the other end before Harold asked one quiet question. "What is the guest's name?" Emily looked toward the entrance where Ethan still waited with calm dignity, untouched by the whispers surrounding him. "His name," she replied carefully, "is Ethan Brooks." The silence that followed felt longer than any answer, and when Harold finally spoke again, his voice had completely changed. "Do not let him leave," he said. "I am on my way." Emily lowered the phone slowly, Her face drained of color by the urgency in Harold Whitmore's voice. She had expected surprise. She had not expected absolute certainty. Before she could speak, Megan stepped beside her and folded her arms. "Well?" she asked. Emily hesitated for only a second. "Mr. Whitmore is coming back immediately." Megan dismissed the answer with a wave of her hand. "He is probably responding because you made this sound like an emergency." Kyle smirked. "By the time he gets here, this guy will be gone." Megan turned toward Ethan once more, determined to end the situation before anyone else questioned her judgment. "Sir, I am asking you one final time to leave the entrance. We have accommodated you long enough." Ethan looked at her with the same quiet composure that had never left his face. "I was invited to wait." Megan frowned. "By whom?" "By the truth," Ethan replied. The answer irritated her more than an argument would have. Around them, conversations had almost completely stopped. The dining room no longer sounded like a busy family restaurant. It sounded like a courtroom moments before a verdict. The older gentleman returned to his table but kept his attention fixed on the entrance. Several guests who had finished eating remained seated instead of requesting their checks. Even the little girl by the window continued watching Ethan with innocent curiosity while her parents exchanged uncertain glances. Ethan's eyes drifted toward the corner booth beneath the faded photograph, and for a brief moment the restaurant around him disappeared into memory. He was 9 years old again, sitting across from his mother as she divided one slice of warm apple pie into 2 equal halves. She had smiled and told him that generosity was never measured by how much someone gave, but by how quietly they gave it. Years later, when financial records revealed that this restaurant might close forever after months of declining business, Ethan remembered that lesson. He instructed his foundation to deliver the first donation anonymously. When expenses continued to rise, another gift followed. Then another. Payroll was protected. Local suppliers were paid. The lights stayed on. Families kept gathering around these same tables without ever knowing how close they had come to losing the place they loved. Ethan had refused every request to place his name on a plaque or dedicate a dining room in his honor. "If people remember kindness," he had once told his assistant Grace, "they never need to remember who paid for it." The memory faded as Megan stepped closer again. "You still have not explained why you are here," she said. Ethan answered honestly. "I came because my mother loved this place. Today would have been her birthday." The words settled softly over the room. Emily lowered her eyes. Even Kyle's expression faltered for an instant before pride returned to cover it. Megan remained unmoved. "That does not change our decision," she replied. Ethan nodded gently. "No," he said. "It simply explains why I stayed." Outside, the sound of a car pulling quickly into the parking lot interrupted the silence. Heads turned instinctively toward the front windows as a familiar vehicle came to a stop. The restaurant owner had returned far sooner than anyone expected, and the atmosphere inside shifted once again, as though the building itself knew that the next few minutes would determine far more than where one man would have dinner. The front door opened before anyone had time to speak again. Harold Whitmore entered with hurried steps, his jacket still unbuttoned from the drive back, scanning the dining room with growing concern. The familiar warmth he usually carried into the restaurant disappeared the instant his eyes reached the entrance. He saw Ethan standing quietly where he had been left waiting, saw the uncertain expressions on his guests, saw Emily near the service station, and finally saw Megan and Kyle still blocking the doorway. Harold did not ask for an explanation. He understood immediately that something had gone terribly wrong. Megan walked toward him with forced confidence. "Mr. Whitmore, I am glad you are here. We were just handling a customer who refused to leave after we exercised our right to deny service." Harold never looked at her. His eyes remained fixed on Ethan. "How long has he been standing here?" he asked quietly. Emily answered before anyone else could. "Almost 20 minutes. Harold closed his eyes for a brief second, disappointment washing across his face like a heavy weight. Kyle stepped forward, still unaware of the significance of the moment. "Sir, do not worry. We kept the situation under control." Harold slowly turned toward him. "Did you?" he asked. The question carried no anger, only a calm that somehow felt even more unsettling. Ethan offered the same respectful smile he had worn since arriving. "Good evening, Harold." Harold walked directly toward him and stopped only a few feet away. "Ethan," he replied softly, "I am deeply sorry that your visit began this way." The dining room fell completely silent. Several guests exchanged confused looks. Megan frowned, trying to understand why the owner sounded less like a businessman addressing a difficult customer, and more like an old friend greeting someone he genuinely respected. Harold extended his hand, but Ethan shook his head gently and returned only a warm smile. "You do not owe me an apology," Ethan said. "You were not here." Harold looked around the room before answering. "Perhaps not. But this is still my responsibility." Emily felt a quiet sense of relief. Everything she had remembered was true. The older gentleman nodded to himself as though every unanswered question had finally found its answer. Megan tried to regain control of the conversation. "Mr. Whitmore, I still do not understand why everyone is reacting this way. We simply followed policy." Harold finally faced her. "Which policy?" he asked. "The one that refuses service to respectful guests?" Megan hesitated. "We believed," Harold interrupted gently. "That is exactly the problem. You believed before you verified." Ethan remained silent, allowing Harold to speak without interruption. There was no satisfaction on his face, no desire to embarrass anyone. He simply watched the room with quiet patience. Harold drew a slow breath and looked back at Ethan. "Grace called me herself," he said. "The moment I heard your name, I left everything behind because I knew this could not wait." Several guests whispered again after hearing that the restaurant owner had personally rushed back for the man standing quietly at the entrance. Whatever story they had imagined moments earlier was no longer possible. Something much larger had been unfolding in front of them all along, and the truth now stood only a single conversation away from changing every assumption inside the restaurant. Harold Whitmore slowly turned toward every table in the dining room before speaking, as though he wanted every guest to hear exactly what came next. His voice remained steady, but the emotion behind it was impossible to miss. "There is something every person in this restaurant deserves to know," he said. 5 years ago this business was days away from closing forever. We had exhausted our savings. We could barely cover payroll. I had already begun writing letters to employees explaining that their jobs might disappear before the end of the month. The room remained perfectly still. Even the kitchen seemed quieter than before. Harold looked at Ethan with unmistakable gratitude. Then an anonymous donation arrived. Large enough to keep every employee working. Large enough to pay every supplier. Large enough to give this restaurant another chance. Megan stared at him without speaking. Kyle's confident posture disappeared. Harold continued. The donations did not stop there. Whenever another crisis appeared, help arrived before we asked. We searched for years to thank the person responsible, but he refused interviews, plaques, celebrations, and publicity. He said this place belonged to the community, not to him. Harold took one slow step toward Ethan. The man standing in front of you is Ethan Brooks. He is the largest donor this restaurant has ever known. Without his generosity, these doors would have closed years ago. The words settled over the dining room with the weight of complete silence. No one reached for a fork. No one whispered. It was as though time itself paused to absorb what had just been revealed. Emily lowered her head, relief replacing uncertainty. The older gentleman smiled softly, no longer surprised, only saddened that recognition had arrived so late. The little girl near the window looked at her father again and quietly whispered. "He was trying to help them?" Her father nodded without taking his eyes off Ethan. Megan's face lost all color. She looked from Harold to Ethan and back again, searching for some sign that this had to be a misunderstanding. I did not know," she finally managed to say. Ethan answered with complete honesty. "That is true. You did not." Kyle swallowed hard, suddenly remembering every careless word he had spoken since Ethan first entered the restaurant. Harold faced both employees with visible disappointment. The greatest mistake made tonight was not failing to recognize an important guest, he said. It was deciding how someone deserved to be treated before learning anything about them. Ethan remained exactly where he had stood from the beginning. He had not raised his voice. He had not demanded special treatment. He had not once mentioned his business, his foundation, or the donations that had preserved the restaurant. Harold looked around the room once more before adding, if Ethan Brooks had walked through that door for the very first time in his life with nothing more than enough money to buy one simple meal, he still deserved the same welcome every family receives here. Respect is not reserved for generous donors. It belongs to every guest. Several customers slowly rose from their seats. No one applauded yet. The moment felt too personal for celebration. Instead, they stood in quiet acknowledgement of a truth that had exposed something far deeper than a mistake at the front entrance. Ethan met Harold's eyes and offered the same calm smile that had carried him through every unfair assumption that evening. "Thank you," he said softly. "Now perhaps we can talk about what truly matters." The silence inside the restaurant lasted only a moment before Harold Whitmore took another slow breath and faced his staff. His disappointment was unmistakable, but his voice never rose. "Megan," he said quietly, "step away from the hostess stand." She obeyed without argument, her confidence gone. "Kyle, join us." He did the same, unable to meet anyone's eyes. Harold looked from one employee to the other, then toward every guest who had witnessed the evening unfold. "Hospitality is not measured by how well we welcome people we recognize," he said. "It is measured by how we treat complete strangers." The words settled over the dining room with greater force than any accusation could have carried. Ethan remained silent. He had not asked for punishment. He had not demanded apologies. He simply waited. Harold continued, "Effective immediately, both of you are relieved of your duties for tonight pending a full review of what happened here. You will meet with me tomorrow morning. Until then, you will not represent this restaurant." Megan's shoulders dropped. "Mr. Whitmore," she said quietly, "I made a terrible mistake." Harold nodded once. "You did. But the mistake was not refusing service to Ethan Brooks. The mistake was believing someone deserved less respect because of what you assumed before you even knew his name." Kyle finally found his voice. "I never thought," Harold interrupted gently. "That is exactly why we are here. You never stopped to think." Emily stood quietly near the service station, unsure whether she should step forward. Harold smiled at her with gratitude. "Emily, thank you for speaking up when something did not feel right. Courage is often quiet, but it changes everything." Emily lowered her head, humbled by the recognition. Around the room, several guests nodded in agreement. The older gentleman slowly rose from his table again. "Young lady," he said to Emily, "your parents would be proud of you." She smiled through grateful eyes. Harold then turned back to Ethan. "I owe you more than an apology. I owe your mother's memory the promise that this place will become what she believed it already was." Ethan looked toward the corner booth beneath the old photograph and answered softly, "That is all I ever hoped for." Harold faced the dining room once more. "Beginning tomorrow, every employee will complete additional hospitality and guest respect training. We will review our hiring practices, our service standards, and every complaint we may have dismissed too quickly. No guest should ever leave wondering whether they were welcomed because of who they were, or because of how they looked." The guests responded not with loud celebration but with sincere applause that spread naturally from one table to another. It was not applause for wealth. It was applause for accountability. Megan quietly removed her manager badge and placed it on the hostess stand. Kyle did the same with his employee badge. Neither argued. Neither blamed anyone else. They understood that the lesson before them reached far beyond one difficult evening. Harold finally picked up 2 menus himself and walked toward Ethan with genuine warmth. "There is a table waiting," he said. Ethan smiled kindly but glanced around the restaurant before answering. "Only if every family who walks through these doors tonight is welcomed with that same kindness." Harold nodded without hesitation. "From this moment forward," he replied, "that will be our standard." Harold led Ethan to the familiar corner booth beneath the faded photograph. But before either man sat down, Ethan paused and looked across the dining room one final time. Families had returned to their conversations, children laughed again, and the warm rhythm of the restaurant slowly found its way back, yet something important had changed. The room felt lighter, not because an influential guest had finally been recognized, but because the people inside had witnessed what genuine accountability looked like. Ethan rested one hand on the back of the chair his mother had loved years before. She always said this was the happiest restaurant in town, he said quietly. I wanted to believe that was still true. Harold nodded with sincere regret. Tonight reminded me that a good reputation is not something a business earns once. It is something we must deserve every single day. Ethan smiled gently. That is why I came back. Emily approached the table carrying 2 glasses of iced tea. Her hands trembled slightly, but this time it was from emotion rather than uncertainty. Mr. Brooks, she said, thank you for staying. Ethan looked up at her with warmth. Thank you for speaking when it would have been easier to stay silent. Emily smiled, understanding that courage sometimes began with nothing more than asking one honest question. Harold then reached into a small folder he had brought from his office. There is something I have wanted to return to you for years, he said. Inside was a framed copy of the first anonymous donation letter that had saved the restaurant. The signature line had always been blank. Harold placed it gently on the table. I kept this because it reminded me that kindness does not always introduce itself. Ethan studied the letter for a moment before sliding it back across the table. Keep it here, he said. Not because of me, but because every new employee should know what this place stands for. Harold nodded. It will hang where everyone can read it. The older gentleman walked past the table on his way out and tipped his hat respectfully toward Ethan. Thank you for saving more than a restaurant, he said. You reminded all of us what respect is supposed to look like. Ethan thanked him with a quiet smile. Near the entrance, the little girl who had asked why he could not come inside earlier waved shyly before leaving with her parents. Ethan waved back, hoping that what she remembered from the evening would not be the unfairness at the beginning but the fairness that followed. As the front door closed behind the last of the departing guests, Harold looked around the dining room with renewed determination. Policies could be rewritten. Training could be improved. Mistakes could become lessons if people were willing to learn from them. Ethan finally took his seat beneath the old photograph, not as a celebrated donor, not as the chief executive of a successful company, but as a son honoring the memory of the woman who taught him that dignity never depends on recognition. The meal placed before him was simple, just as it had been years earlier, and somehow it tasted exactly the same. Before lifting his fork, Ethan looked toward Harold one last time and said, I never wanted anyone to know my name. I only wanted every person who walked through these doors to feel that they belonged. Harold answered without hesitation. Then tonight you raised something far greater than a donation. You raised the standard.